Missed opportunity is a phrase that you'll hear quite often throughout Need for Speed's legacy. Pro Street, Unbound, Carbon, hell even Payback could easily be labeled as missed opportunities. It's the price to pay for ambition in a series as stochastic as Need for Speed, but nothing remotely comes close to the colossal disaster of 2008's Need for Speed Undercover. Many of the series' most divisive games at least have genuine merit, no matter how divisive the sum of their parts may be. But Undercover stands alone even 17 years later as the one entry which broke critics, fans, and damn near set the series as a whole into a turbulent downfall. This video serves as my testament to the story of Undercover, an analysis of this game's tumultuous development, the finished product's shady missteps, and the few bits of light that shine through the stunted ports. This is the worst Need for Speed ever made. Need for Speed Undercover. Undoubtedly the most intriguing place to start with the enigma that is Undercover is with the development of this project. Believe it or not, conceptualizing an art started floating around EA Black Box even before the release of Need for Speed Most Wanted, as the game initially was even codenamed MW2, or more aptly, Most Wanted 2. There are still remnants of this even in the finished product, with the PS2 port even having throwbacks to the iconic bridge jump, and the map itself being a retooled and jumbled up rock port. The concept art for what at this time was to be known as Most Wanted 2 was really intriguing. Original orchestrations of Tri-City Bay painted a far more diverse and invoking world than what the game would eventually release as. Now granted, it is important to take into account that concept art is always going to be more dramatic than the finished product. But even with that, I want to look at some of my favorite pieces of the concept art. This right here is one of my favorites. This wonderful, more suburban block, painted in rain and accompanied by a more resplendent mix of greens to contrast the vibrancy of the sunset and the backdrop city skyline. Moving outwards away from the city was mountainous, with beautiful elevation, scenic drives right alongside lakes and dams, complemented by focal points such as this mid-construction observatory or these giant valley canyons. Some of these concept roads outside of the city even quite strongly remind me of Need for Speed Rivals, with this shot in particular. But what without a doubt took primary focus as the focal point of artistic design was the central city. Undercover would certainly improve the sense of scale in its most urban areas, with a real concrete jungle feeling that would tower over the original Most Wanted cityscapes. It wasn't just skyscrapers, but plentiful freeways, bridges, dilapidated slum districts, and more construction sites than you could ever imagine. And cranes. But I'll get to that more in depth later. Now of course, this is about as good an example as any that concept art well and truly doesn't always match the final product. The art is brilliant, and honestly considering how messy development was, many of these concepts seem to bleed into other EA games, such as Burnout Paradise, which shares a lot of that grungy, urban-esque flair that this artwork personified. With the game itself, it would start production in the latter half of Carbon's development, under the working title of Need for Speed The Chase. The story, themes, and narrative would revolve around a far more mature story than any prior entry. Even though Most Wanted and Carbon both had their respective merits in their live-action storytelling, they had their comedic undertones, which wasn't the vibe that Black Box wanted to go with for The Chase. Instead, the game would be a more stoic and serious take on the vibe that the Fast and Furious movies were going for. Everything so far sounds honestly pretty brilliant, doesn't it? I mean genuinely, not only is the concept art really impressive, but the story brief and more mature tones was absolutely an interesting way to evolve from the traditional boy racer archetype that the series had been known for in the 2000s. Except, everything was about to go seriously wrong. As full production ramped up, EA would throw a wrench in the mix, splitting the development team at Black Box into 3 separate groups. One would start development on 2007's Need for Speed Pro Street. The second would develop the infamous Skate, releasing just a month after Pro Street, while the third and final subset of Black Box's remaining staff would work on The Chase for its 2008 target release. Splitting your team in half is already concerning. You have half the crew that was originally planned to orchestrate a project's vision, pawning twice the workload onto each individual on the team. So just imagine what it would be like to have the entirety of Black Box working on at least 3 entirely separate large-scale game projects at the same time. And this is the very crux of the issue here. After this strong crunch period, many employees left Black Box Studios. And while yes, after the releases of Pro Street and Skate, the team did indeed go full bore on the realization and development of what would then be named Need for Speed Undercover, the deadline was soon approaching, and it was far too late for all who remained to fully capture the vision of Undercover. Yet somehow, it gets worse. Because due to the critical reception of Pro Street, which received lackluster reviews to say the least during its launch, all eyes would be on Undercover to bring the fans back. You have to remember that at this time, Black Box was still communally very much in the limelight. Their entire run, from Hot Pursuit 2 all the way to Pro Street in 2007, was still not as far away as Forza Horizon 4 is now in 2025. So just put that into perspective. Their fans didn't really have any letdowns apart from with Pro Street, so surely Undercover, the renaissance of open-world street racing and Need for Speed, would revitalize the series once more, if only that were true. Undercover would be the lowest rated mainline Need for Speed by a healthy margin, and compounding on the already low morale over the release of Pro Street, dug the series into an inconsistent loop, struggling to regain traction for years on end. There have been flashes of greatness, yes, and even to this day, I would still argue that Need for Speed has never regained that consistent household label that it once so proudly wore with pride. Going back to the topic of Pro Street for a moment, there's something I want to look at from this modern perspective that helps paint an interesting picture of both of these games in a modern light. You see, both of these games did very poorly communally at launch. That's just a fact of the matter. However, Pro Street, especially in recent years, has gained a second win with a huge and loyal flock of fans, while Undercover has unquestionably remained at the very bottom tier in the vast majority of fans' eyes. So why is this? Well, the answer is honestly quite simple. Pro Street was the right game at the very wrong time. Just as racing games were transitioning towards open worlds, and the street racing niche was at the peak of its game, EA Black Box pivoted exactly away from where trends were going, and that just didn't sit well with critics and fans alike, who this change in tone perturbed from enjoying Pro Street's best qualities and different spin on the series. So in the modern day, where open world racing games are a dime a dozen, playing Pro Street's radically different take away from the time period where it was seen as a strange departure, its twist on festivals and street racing is a waft of fresh, creative air. Undercover was conceptually exactly what it needed to be at the time. It was just what those critics were looking for to dichotomize Pro Street's different approach. The issue was, the execution of this concept was truly and utterly catastrophic. This wasn't a case of right game, wrong time, such as with Pro Street. There was simply an inexcusable mess, which left everything to be desired right on the drafting table. And with that, I want to move on to analyzing the finished product, and just why this game failed to capture the fans' hearts and the conceptual vision of this project. And there is no better place for me to start than with its presentation. One of the things that I've come to love the most about Need for Speed, not only as I've played these games throughout my life, but as I've gone back to analyze many of them for you lovely folks, is that these games love to differentiate and mix up the style of these entries. Hot Pursuit looks nothing like Need for Speed 2015. Pro Street looks so different to Carbon, even though they released a single year apart and share many assets. And this is because of the creative risks that more often than not pay off. I'd even argue that Need for Speed Unbound, while I wish it did more to commit to its radical shift in art style, I enjoy how zany and out there the effects work is in comparison to most of the racing games in this era. Now with that said, to set the stage, let's use the game that Undercover was supposed to sequel as an example here. Sure, there's a decent amount of people who don't jive well with the yellow piss filter that the game has been structured around, but I don't think anyone can deny that in terms of a stylistic choice, it wasn't half-assed, and that's because the game's art direction as a whole leaned into that grungy, heavily filtered approach. Need for Speed Undercover is hands down one of the worst looking video games I have ever played. And I'm not talking from a fidelity point of view, as to me that's honestly not that large of a deal when it comes to games. Purely based off of art direction, Undercover is utterly horrific to look at. Most prominently when it comes to the game's issues is the superfluous bloom filter, which feels like an assault on the eyeballs. The implementation of this is far too egregious. You know the filtered look that I just mentioned with Most Wanted, and how it worked because the whole game was designed around it. Well, it sure as hell wasn't here, because how do you possibly make an uglier color palette than this? And I use the word color very lightly there, because every tone or shade feels so devoid of life. And sure, I will admit there are times where it isn't that bad. Lower light scenarios such as sunset or sunrise can actually sometimes not look half terrible, but by that point the bloom has faded to a point where you can actually see the rest of the art design's faults. Let's start with the effects work. You know how Carbon and Most Wanted, for example, would use a healthy amount of motion blur when you boost with nitrous, and accentuate the bloom and luminescence of your taillights, creating a smooth trail effect. What this does is isolate the world around you, and it allows you to focus dead in on your driving. And at the same time, it makes activating nitrous feel special, even though it doesn't give you a speed increase which necessarily correlates with how these effects make you feel. In Undercover, the effects which happen when you boost are so lackluster. There's the world's tiniest bit of blur around the edges of your screen, which doesn't do anywhere near enough to lock you into your boost. And guess what? Due to how egregious the bloom post-processing effects are in terms of hijacking your vision, you can't even see it most of the time. Those taillight trails that I mentioned are also completely gone. I mean, sure, the camera does jump back a bit to give you somewhat of a greater sense of speed, but that's the oldest trick in the book, and a natural reality of a larger field of view. It isn't intelligent or creative in any way. All of this goes without mentioning just how lame the map of the Tri-Cities is. I mean, by this point in time, Need for Speed was one of the racing games which pushed open worlds in this genre the most. Look at Bayview, Rockport, Palmont City. They stood apart uniquely from each other, with different tones, colors, verticality, and most importantly to me, having iconic viewpoints or infamous spots on the map. I'll use Underground 2's giant central fountain and the casinos as an example here. Tri-City Bay instead just feels painfully derivative. And not only that, because being derivative on its own isn't necessarily a bad thing, it just doesn't even stand up to the same level of quality as those aforementioned maps. The city doesn't really feel all that large, just a giant pot of land with copy and paste buildings all over. Everywhere outside of the city, for the most part, blends together. It's missing exactly what an open world needs visually to stand out. Character. Although you want to know what visually the Tri-City Bay brings to the table? Cranes. No, I'm properly not joking. Take a look at some of the background here. Why is there so many? Different clip. Cranes. Another one. Hey, more cranes. I dare someone with more time than they know what to do with to count the amount of cranes that you see in this video, because I imagine it's utterly stupendous. Someone on the development team had to have had a bloody crane fetish. These cranes are more often than not tied to construction sites, which in most racing game maps may be, I don't know, maybe one or two construction sites in them. Undercover is littered with them. No matter where you go in the city, you're about to find one right around the corner. The sheer amount is so comical that I almost think of it as an analogy for the game itself. Under construction all the way to the very end, left unfinished. And from a function perspective, it can't even redeem itself this way. No, seriously, the map itself is so bad that Blackbox added in a prompt which will constantly flash in your face during free roam to quick start the next event in line. And I honestly don't blame them. Traversing this world sucks. The city is just aimless curve after aimless curve. I get fictionizing a location to make it more fun to drive in. That's of course a reality of game design, and it results in some pretty amazing maps. But the physics here don't even really match the road network. Basically, the only nice thing that I can say about this game's presentation is, well, honestly, I kinda like the aesthetic of the UI and the general theming of components such as the map to fit the investigative blueprinty style. Oh, and the little intro cinematics that play when you start a race are honestly pretty damn sick. There's a ton of them, and it's a great way to build up atmosphere. And on the topic of atmosphere, the soundtrack of Undercover is something that's brought up quite a lot as one of its positives. Which is true, but maybe not quite as true as you may think, and let me explain. Most Need for Speeds use licensed music for the vast majority of their soundtracks, with a few ambient or pursuit tracks composed by the studio themselves. Yes, some of the licensed music is actually pretty great. My personal favorite additions being that of Girls in Black by Airborne and Genesis by Justice. But honestly, there is plenty of skips throughout the track list as well. And to be honest, it's in general hard to praise a few good songs in a licensed soundtrack because, well, they're just songs that I've listened to before and I already like them. It doesn't really have anything to do with Undercover, it's just, I really like those artists. The original compositions don't help things much. They're fine, but I could not name you a single track that I would actively listen to outside of the game, which is so unlike Carbon, for example, where I still listen to some of the garage themes to this day. The garage theme in Undercover is totally fine, and so is the pursuit music. But again, I not only just don't think any of it necessarily fits the theme of the game, or is all that catchy or memorable. All in all, the art design left virtually everything to be desired back in the concept art. The drama and effects work is not inherently terrible, don't get me wrong, but in comparison to its predecessors, it's just not enough. And the same goes for this world. I really did take an open mind when going back to play this game, as it's been well over a decade since I last did so. And well, time did not do any of this any justice. And it's a shame. But so far, most everything that I've discussed has been in the realm of form, and yet, what about function? A successful campaign was critical to this era of Need for Speed. The series up to this point had developed a thesis of revolving every element of the world, police, and how you handle your cars around the gameplay loop that the main campaign brought forward to you. It's the reason that games like Most Wanted are so fun to play, and have remained that way. The loop was engaging, and through the balance of using the open world to advance your story, compete in events, or even just rack up bounty for the fun of it, the whole package was cohesive because it works diegetically through this campaign. The issue is, when you make a game that comes after such a tightly crafted style of play, you have to either put an entirely new twist on it, or make what made that original game fun even better. Now, when we look towards Undercover, there's something that I have to lay out on the table before I get into the nitty-gritty. Yes, for the most part, the game plays fine, though that was always going to be the case, because under the hood, this game is virtually just a retooled version of the prior Black Box games. So yes, on a structural level, it's alright to play, but that's not down to Undercover's own merit, but a reality of the engine used in development. Let's go over the gameplay in Undercover, as this is where you'll find some of what Undercover actually does do quite well. But it's also what exacerbates the game's issues to a fairly extreme extent. Let's just get the good out of the way, as I want to talk about Undercover's event variety. The events throughout the Tri-City Bay are honestly pretty chock full of variety. Race events are as expected in a Need for Speed. They work. The AI isn't absolutely horrible. It's pretty serviceable, and that's not an insult at all. You've also got jobs, which will toss you into a car that you don't own, with the task of typically outrunning the police or doing plenty of cost-to-state damage. Sure, these are just reskins of the typical outrun or cost-to-state modes, but due to the game's pretty stunted progression, which I'll get to in a moment, this is basically the only way that I've found to experience a variety of different cars throughout my playtime. The best event type though? Easily and without question, the highway battles. These are the biggest breath of fresh air in all of Undercover. They pit you in a one-on-one showdown against your opponent, blasting it down the highway almost TXR style. The traffic count is also bumped up far higher through the engine, so you aren't just aimlessly blasting down an empty highway. There's proper risk involved if you want to try and go for a gap Ayrton Senna style. Now, with this being said, the game modes and events may be fine when you're in them for the most part, but everything surrounding them sours the experience. How about the dreadful economy, which makes it so that in the early to mid game, you'll earn barely any cash at all. So bad that even when you're primarily gifted cars through pink slips, you'll have the cash to upgrade them. But God forbid you'd like to buy a car with your own cash to experience more of the list, as all of the cash that you will have earned has gone towards those upgrades. This gets a lot better in the late game, with event payouts jumping up by a staggering margin. But by that point, you'll be so fed up with the repetitive and grindy gameplay loop that, well, you'll just want to rush to the end and be done with the game. What compounds on top of this is Undercover's erratic difficulty, or should I say, lack thereof. 99% of the game is piss easy. Genuinely, you will not struggle with anything. Be it races, police chases, cost-to-state objectives, you're going to breeze through Undercover, and it just makes the gameplay loop even more soulless. You'll be at the midpoint of the game and racing against McLaren SLRs and Lamborghini Gallardos in a Plummet Evo, and smashing them at that. Though for such an easy game, there is one circuit race that I can't for the life of me remember the name of, that is an absolute nightmare due to busted AI. My friend Fastminer07 had the exact same issue, which he mentioned in his own segment in his video on the Need for Speed series, which I'll link to down in the description down below. In a whole other realm of underwhelming in regards to this game, we have the police system. It's worth mentioning that due to the change in theme between Most Wanted and Carbon, the downpaid police, while underwhelming, due to the game being structured more around the fact that, well, the police weren't as big of a piece of Carbon. However, Undercover's police are a huge part of the game's theming and gameplay loop. Here's the thing though, the police have nothing to them. They're butt easy to escape from. There's no depth to the chases, no strategic ways for police to take you down or mix up chases. And when you're mid-pursuit too, the atmosphere is so vapid. Remember all of the over 12 1,000 lines of police chatter that was recorded for Most Wanted. Not only was that amount near on superfluous, but the quality of that dialogue is next level, because it was a huge new feature, and it had to live up to the hype of being such a large part of the game's theming. Undercover's police dialogue just has no charm, no spunk. Take a listen to these examples.
Officers on the pursuit call. Suspect vehicle was last seen heading south on Ocean Hills Drive. Supervisor requesting you set up a quadrant ASAP. Units remain on Code 6 status till further notice.
We got the road ahead blocked off. But we gotta close some more streets.
The only good thing that I can say about the police is that these takedown cutscenes are absolutely S tier. How do you not laugh at that? It's just so funny. These stupendously over-the-top cutscenes had to have eaten up all the development budget for the police section of this game. It is genuinely hilarious. So all in all, the gameplay doesn't match up to its older brothers, but what I also think helps contextualize just how disappointing what Undercover brought to the table was, is when you look at 2008's other racing games. MotorStorm Pacific Rift, Pure, Race Driver Grid, and for a more direct comparison, Midnight Club LA. This is the level of quality that Undercover was in direct competition with. It doesn't take a genius to see that while some of these games are different conceptually to Undercover, the level of execution and passion poured into them far exceeds the wasteland of empty soul, which is Undercover. The last thing to talk about in the realm of gameplay is the cars themselves and how they're handled. Customization is pretty much a simplified Pro Street, and well, same goes for the performance parts. You know how Carbon added in another level of depth with the ability to have pseudo-tuning for each individual part? Well, all gone now apart from a radically simplified menu, except for the PS2 port, because yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, have I mentioned at all yet that this is mostly because stat upgrades get boosts by an RPG-like percentage increase system? This isn't Persona or Final Fantasy, guys. This is Need for Speed. It properly perplexes me why they decided to dumb things down for this clearly arbitrary system. What's the logic here? You do more races and your brakes get bigger? Just why? And so far, the presentation of Undercover, certainly far from perfect. The gameplay, far from redeemable. So please tell me that this story can help. Oh boy. Where I found the most promise in the project of Undercover was through the narrative that the original draft conjured up. A dark, mysterious, enigmatic take on the traditional street racer tropes. This soon became a serious issue though. Writing a story which revolves around that concept has to be written well. Character motives need to be understandable. The characters themselves need to be well played so it doesn't seem too cheesy, and the plot itself has to engage you, the audience. Need for Speed's prior and former never really did this apart from maybe The Run or Rivals. There's always been an element of comedy and self-awareness to the writing in these typically campy stories. Most Wanted and Need for Speed 2015 have some pretty cheesy and comedic writing, but the thing is, they don't take themselves seriously and just go full bore on leaning into that. The immediate issue that you'll realize with Undercover is not only is the writing glued together by string cheese and performed about as well as a C-grade sitcom, there's no element of self-awareness. It utterly believes that the story being told is great, and so there's this disconnected stoicism in how this writing unfolds, and for me at least, it utterly ruins the narrative. This is precisely why I begrudged going through this story again, because this had to be the single greatest setup in the history of the series, and this concept is incredible, and yet it was completely butchered. With this being said, let's dive on in from the premise, and allow me to explain just why this narrative fails. We start our story as the iconic player. Need for Speed had such a strange obsession with this around this time. The plot from the start is simple yet intriguing. We hone in on a meeting between our pseudo-boss Chase Lynn and the police chief of our department. There's been a large ring of car smuggling incidents around the Tri-City Bay street racing scene in a potential international car theft smuggling crew, and so ourselves the player will be going undercover to infiltrate the street racing scene as a fellow street racer. It's a good start, but it doesn't last. You'll soon start to notice all sorts of inconsistencies in world building as you start doing tasks for Chase. And it's one of the things that creates a large disconnect between these cutscenes and the world that you're playing in, such as actors not even wearing the same clothing between camera shots in the same cutscene, or the fact that whenever you start a race, The cars on the starting grid don't even remotely resemble the class or make of the ones in the live-action cutscenes. It's a huge example of diegetic disconnect, where you almost feel as if you're playing a video game on its own that occasionally pauses to play clips from a totally unrelated TV show. The integration of this universe is textbook incompetence. You'll soon get your first lead in the initial crew that you join, that being a pair of brothers, Zach and Hector, who run their own series of car thefts in the city. I sure hope this doesn't turn out to be a completely obvious red herring. One thing that I've always found strange is that during the undercover work that we perform for them, we actively steal cars and perform jobs for the gang, inherently giving them the cars that they need to keep functioning. What a shitty police job. It's not like this happens once or twice. No, it's actively the point of the game to earn their trust. You'll also around this point in time meet Carmen, whose entire point for now is just to thirst over the main character. I mean, not complaining, but hey, she really doesn't have that much more to her character than that. With Zach and Hector, you'll play a little bit, gain their trust, and take them down in some of the most whack takedown missions that you will ever play. Seriously, these just utterly suck, gameplay-wise. But once you're done this, it's learned that, oh no, that wasn't who we needed. Who would have thunk? And so you'll move the investigation further out to the outskirts of the city to try out more gangs in the search, where, oh, the exact cars they were looking for were found. We quite literally have all of the evidence that we need right in front of us to close this case, including the leader of the gang. But we keep going. Okay? The characters in this bit are so awkward because they're horrifically overacted while being the single most plain milquetoast character archetypes on the planet. G-Mac, he exists. Rose and her overreactive boyfriend feel like Fast and Furious background actors. There's no real reason to be invested here. And you know what's absolutely hilarious about that narrative disconnect that I mentioned earlier is in one of the cutscenes, G-Mac offers you a bunch of pink slips to choose what model of car you play with next, and he recommends the Viper belonging to one of the crew members, which would be great if that model of Viper was even in the game. There is in fact a Viper, but not only is it the generation after the one shown in the cutscene, but it isn't even in the options given to you. Lord, this game is something. You'll continue to grind through jobs for G-Mac now, and occasionally get plot points teased with Carmen getting attacked at random, and a sweaty-ass dude in the back of the car calling chase. Like, come on dude, it's not 1952, you've got reclaim events. No need to be dramatic. It's soon confirmed that G-Mac's gang was the one exporting these cars to South America. Like we didn't already know that from the fact this was quite literally spelt out for us the second we joined the gang, but whatever. There's also this strange side, I don't even know what to call it, where Rose invites us to a race and her boyfriend cuts her brake lines nearly killing you. Alright. While we recover from this accident, Chase's boss was doing his homework, and he made a connection that an Asian crime syndicate and the name Chow Wu, who was the same guy who called Chase earlier, was involved in these carjackings. The cutscene's fine, but the performances were making me fall asleep until...
Very dangerous.
Where did that come from? So the job from here on out is to steal Chow's car and frame him for the carjackings, something I don't think was necessary if the chief had done his due diligence and had legitimate evidence. Just arrest both G-Mac's gang and then Chow. But again, whatever. It's revealed to us that what we've been looking for, a specific car, had been stolen from him. So the mission then turns to taking down G-Mac's gang until Carmen calls us. Oh man, she became relevant. And she reveals to us that Zach had had the car under wraps the whole time. And wait, that's not even the same car, you mongs. Look, it's blue. The one in game is gray. Whatever. I sure hope nothing bad happens when we tell Chase? Son of a bitch was working with Chow this whole time. Okay, I sure hope this doesn't get any more crazy. You have got to be kidding me. Chase was using us and the police to get what was hidden inside the M6. And once she's got it, the final mission is to chase her down and end her once and for all. So, why was Chase doing all of this? Well, there was a device inside which held all of the evidence for the case so far. Why Chase decided to go behind everyone's back, while we all quite definitively already had a lead on this, I have no idea. Apart from the game just wanting someone to take the fall for everyone else. This story, what do I even say? It's so messy, sloppy, it hardly even connects with the world that the game sets up. The conclusion is rushed beyond salvation. But considering the game as a whole, I guess that's pretty on brand, isn't it? Somehow though, This gets worse. When you look at the story and the game as a whole when you're playing on the PlayStation 2, I myself don't have the most in-depth experience with this version, but I do have a very good friend who does, so I'll pass this segment on to my good friend, Detective Phat Weedington. Take it away.
Hello there, I am Detective Phat Weedington, and this section was written by not only me but our friend Moon, who was also collaborating in my channel with writing scripts and giving ideas. I'm going to relate the hell out of this mess that looks like if Quentin Tarantino had a crane fetish instead of a feet one. But unlike a Tarantino film, where they repeat words I'm not even going to say, the story here is the same awful one with the poor writing and the poor imitations of CSI Miami. It's so poor in fact that it makes the show itself look like an episode in Columbo, and if you think the original game was already more of real slop than it is, you didn't experience the horror stories of the PS2 and Wii ports of Undercover. So other than the graphical difference between the two ports and the fact that they share the same lineup as Carbon, the game is essentially a Miami reskin of Most Wanted's Rock port, reconfigured to look like the Tri-City from the other versions, making the buildings and textures being changed to make it look worse than it already were, even to the point where they didn't even change some of them, and there are some areas that are completely closed off or changed for the worse, such as the underground sewage turning into a blocked off car park, despite the fact that it appears on the map, and the jumps into the prison now turn into a mall were butchered to the extreme. It's a simple copy and paste apart from what made the map in Most Wanted work in the first place. It's so much so that you can even find the bridge from the last pursuit of Most Wanted 05, open for full exploration and making losing the cops fairly easy, to an extent. However, the new areas of the game doesn't feel any better because this edition have the worst driving models that any Need for Speed game has ever had, until 7 years later when Need for Speed 2015 arrived and made everything worse. You partially get the same game modes as in the original game, but they're toned down because the PS2 or the Wii if you like to play with a dildo is already begging you to stop running this mess. The races themselves are so bad that you can mistake them of Dumbzo playing the Resident Evil 4 remake. The AI has the same intelligence as the comment section that claims everything is woke DEI, and the physics are so faulty that you can go to the speed of light in a stock eclipse. The hot pursuit missions in this version must be the strangest thing in the world. It almost makes the other ones from the other versions look polished in comparison. Getting busted in this game is nearly impossible as escaping from the police, because the heat level in this game is completely broken, and the backup countdown timer doesn't mean nothing because the game will spawn them almost constantly. Even when you're attempting to conclude, they'll ensure that you're stuck in a Yes King video because they won't fuck off. Not to add that they create barriers every 15 seconds, and these events can last you between 15 to 25 minutes. Even after you're done, they'll sometimes act like you're still in a chase even though everything is done. And don't even get me started on the wheelman objectives that you have to complete in this game, because for some reason some sections are absolute pain in the ass to finish. They're not difficult or anything apart from one mission where you have to save Carbon from a group of triads. It's largely the takeout mission since the game doesn't know if you're trying to hit the person you're trying to take out because the physics in this game are a complete joke. Not to mention that the AI doesn't act like it's being gang stalked and run away from danger. Hell, it can even be stuck. The other missions are completely broken to nonsensical, and it was evident that the developers had insignificant time due to EA being a dumbass captain of a large ship, as this version of the game came out the same day as the others. EA was essentially rushing things or not giving the devs enough time. The only positive part about this port is the local versus, where you can drive cop versions of the Ford Mustang, the Lamborghini Gallardo, and a Volkswagen Beetle, and try to beat your friends driving other cars. And the aforementioned soundtrack, although there are some songs that were cut in this version, and Maggie Q. No, I'm not elaborating, I just really think she's a really good actress. But other than that, that's pretty much it. You have the same other disciplines that haven't remained unchanged since Most Wanted. The only reason I believe this game was considered to begin with was the never-ending popularity that the console had in South America, since neither Sony nor Microsoft started selling consoles, officially at least, in those markets until 2010 when the PS3 and the Xbox 360 arrived to South America. So if you happen to be like this woman right here, who lived her entire life on the countryside of Argentina or any other country in South America and believed that the internet was the most creative invention on earth, you might have experienced this low quality version of an already low quality product. Also, fun fact, this is the only port where the cover car is used in the entire game, where Chase drives it instead of an M6. Yeah, that's fucking strange. Anyways, this game sucks, people who like it are subhuman, and Moses really likes Nicole from ZZZ. Back to you, rat fucker.
Thank you, Weedington, for your insightful commentary. Definitely do not go down to the description and give him a subscribe. I will be very, very upset if you do this. To finish off with Undercover, I want to hone back in on why this game failed. I've talked a lot of smack against this game, but I have to make sure that it's known that I say this out of anger for how EA has and continues to treat many of its studios. Undercover is a bad game, yes, there's no debating that, but that's not because the team behind it was uninspired or the concept itself was bad. Undercover is a terrible video game because of greed and a publisher who treats its IPs and the souls behind them as disposable. I know many of you love Undercover despite its flaws, and I don't want a critical video like this to take away from any of that. While as a product and execution of vision, Undercover missed the mark quite badly. I know that it resonated with many people's childhoods, or it hit at just the right time for some of you, and I respect that. However, there's only so much subjectivity that can be thrown at a game like this. I, without a semblance of doubt in my mind, name Need for Speed Undercover as the worst Need for Speed that I've played. Payback may have had worse design choices, but it was at the very least mediocre apart from that. The poor ports of games are just terrible ports of decent games. Undercover is a rotten product from its very core, and there's no amount of nostalgia, vibes, or an open mind that can get me past that. If you're looking to try the game in the modern day, I highly recommend modding the experience with a reformed mod to make the game less jarring and diminish as many of the game's faults as you can. But nothing can stop this from being the worst Need for Speed ever made.